I had been driving through the back roads of southern Kentucky when the storm hit. The clouds had been building up all afternoon, heavy and dark like wet wool pressed against the sky. I thought I could beat it by staying on the smaller highways, but the rain came down so sudden and so hard that I couldn't see more than a few yards ahead of me. The windshield wipers slapped furiously, but they were no match for the downpour. Water filled the ditches on either side of the narrow road and ran across the blacktop in shallow rivers. My tires kept slipping, and after a mile or two I knew I couldn't risk driving any farther. I pulled off onto a muddy side road that cut through the trees, hoping to wait the storm out somewhere safe. The road wasn't marked on the map, and I doubted many people used it, but it led deeper into the woods until I spotted a small cabin sitting back behind a line of tall oaks. It looked old, maybe abandoned, but it had a roof and 4 walls, which was more than I had sitting in my car in a flood. I parked near the tree line, grabbed my jacket, and trudged through the mud to the cabin. The closer I got, the more I noticed little details. The windows were cracked but covered with old curtains. The wooden steps sagged under my boots, and the screen door hung crooked on its frame. I pushed it open, and it screeched loud enough to make my skin crawl. Inside, the air was stale and carried that damp smell of mildew mixed with something metallic, faint but sharp, like rust or old blood. The cabin had one main room with a small table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove against the far wall. A narrow hallway led to a back room, probably a bedroom. Everything was covered in dust, but the table didn't look like it had been abandoned for long. There were coffee stains on the surface and a dirty plate with the crust of something still stuck to it. Whoever had been here last hadn't cleaned up. I shook the rain off my jacket and set my pack down. The storm rattled the roof, and water streamed down the windows. I figured I'd wait until it let up before heading back out, but I had this unsettled feeling crawling through me, like I had stepped into a place I wasn't supposed to be. I went to check the back room just to make sure the place was empty. The door stuck when I pushed it, swollen from the damp air. Inside was a narrow bed with a stained mattress, a dresser missing half its drawers, and boots kicked under the frame. One wall had a set of shelves stacked with folded clothes, a few police uniforms among them. That made me pause. The uniforms were faded, but the patches were still clear. County Sheriff's Department. There were also 2 gun belts, one empty and one with a holster still holding a revolver. Everything looked like it had been left in a hurry, but not too long ago. Dust covered the dresser, but not the gun belt. That sharp metallic smell in the cabin made more sense when I noticed a dark stain spreading across the floorboards near the bed. At first I thought it was just water damage, but when I crouched closer, I saw the edges of it had turned brown. It was dried blood, a lot of it, and it had soaked deep into the wood. I stood there for a long moment, heart thudding. I didn't know if I should leave or call someone, but with the storm hammering down outside, I wasn't going anywhere fast. The place was quiet except for the rain, but the more I looked, the more details came into focus. In the corner, half hidden under a tarp, was a box of personal items. A wallet with a badge inside, a set of keys, and a folded piece of paper with dates scribbled on it. The badge had a name etched across it, Sheriff Daniel Reed. The wallet still had cash in it, which made it feel even stranger. I opened the dresser drawers that were still intact. Inside were folded shirts, a flashlight, and a stack of folders filled with police reports. Most of the papers were water damaged, but I could make out words like investigation, evidence, and suspension. One report had Reed's name listed as the officer. Another had it crossed out with a thick black marker. By then I realized this wasn't just some abandoned hunting cabin. Something had happened here. The more I searched, the more the story came together in ugly little pieces. The sheriff must have been staying here, maybe hiding out. The blood stain on the floor told me he didn't leave willingly. I checked the wood stove in the main room. Inside were burnt scraps of paper, blackened at the edges but not completely destroyed. Some had parts of names and dates. It looked like someone had been trying to get rid of documents fast. Then I noticed the muddy footprints near the door. They weren't mine. They had dried into the floor, leading from the entrance to the back room and then back again. Some of them overlapped, like whoever made them had paced around more than once. I went back to the bedroom and crouched by the bed. Something stuck out from under the mattress. I pulled it free, a small notebook, wrapped in plastic to keep it dry. The pages inside were filled with rough handwriting. From what I could read, Reed had been investigating something he wasn't supposed to. Mentions of names I didn't know, cash pickups, and too many eyes on me. His last entry was dated 2 weeks ago, and it ended mid-sentence. I sat there with the notebook in my hands, listening to the rain slam the roof, and realized what this cabin really was. A hiding spot that turned into a grave. Whoever had been after him must have found him here, left him to bleed out, and never bothered to move his things. I didn't want to stay, but I also didn't want to walk back out into the storm in the dark. My phone had no service. The road was nothing but mud, and water was pooling around my car's tires. I was stuck until morning. I dragged one of the chairs against the wall, facing the front door, and sat with my back to the wood. I kept the revolver from the holster close, even though I wasn't sure if it was loaded. The cabin creaked with every gust of wind, and the smell of blood lingered no matter how much I tried to ignore it. Sleep was out of the question. All night I thought about what must have happened. Maybe Reed was dirty, maybe he wasn't. Maybe he got in too deep and someone decided he was a problem. Whoever it was, they had left enough behind that anyone nosy enough could piece parts of it together. I wondered if they might ever come back to check. That thought alone kept my eyes fixed on the door until the first light broke through the cracks in the curtains. When the rain finally eased, I didn't waste any time. I stuffed the notebook into my jacket, left the revolver on the table, and stepped back out into the wet morning air. The woods were silent, as if the storm had wrung every sound out of them. My car was caked in mud, but it started on the first try. As I drove back to the main road, I kept replaying the night in my head. That cabin wasn't just a place to get out of the rain. It was a crime scene, left behind like a forgotten page in someone else's story. Sheriff Reed was dead, that much was certain, but no one had come looking for him. By the time I reached town, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't about to keep that notebook hidden, not with the things it said. I took it straight to the local sheriff's office. Whether they cared about what happened to Reed or not wasn't up to me, but at least the truth wouldn't rot away in that cabin in the woods. What stayed with me most wasn't the storm or even the blood on the floorboards. It was how quiet it all had been. No gunshots, no screams, no signs of struggle. Just a man's life erased in silence, hidden in a countryside cabin where no one was supposed to find him. And if I hadn't been caught in that storm, maybe no one ever would have. I still remember the first time I saw that old cabin. It was in the summer of 2012, and I had taken a short trip into the rural part of northern Vermont. I had just turned 30, and I had been spending more time hiking and driving on back roads to escape the noise of the city. Most people went there for the trails, the lakes, or the quiet. But what pulled me off the main route that day was nothing more than a narrow dirt path that curved between two tall rows of pine trees. The road wasn't marked. It looked like a logging trail or maybe something hunters used, but curiosity got the better of me, and I steered my car down it. The road was rough, full of ruts and potholes, and the branches scraped against the sides of the car. After about a mile or so, I came into a clearing. That's where I saw the cabin. It was small, one story, with a sagging roof in gray wood that looked like it had been stripped by years of rain and wind. The windows were dusty and dark, the glass broken in a couple of places, and there were boards nailed over the door in a crude, half-done way. Weeds and tall grass had overtaken the front steps, and an old metal bucket lay rusting in the dirt. At first, I thought it was just another abandoned hunting shack, the kind you see sometimes deep in the woods, but something about it made me slow down and just sit there in the car for a few minutes, staring at it. It didn't look like anyone had been there for decades, but there was a strange order to the place. The grass in the immediate front yard wasn't as tall as the rest, like someone had stomped it down. A trail of disturbed dirt went from the front of the cabin around to the side, and when I stepped out of the car, I saw faint shoe prints in the softer patches of mud near the edge of the clearing. They weren't fresh, but they weren't ancient either. I stood there for a while, listening. The woods were silent. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the hum of distant insects. I should have turned back then, but the pull of that cabin was too strong. I walked toward it slowly, crunching over broken twigs. Up close, the wood of the walls was warped, blackened in spots, and there were rusty nails sticking out where pieces had fallen apart. The boards on the door were old but not rotting, which made me think someone had sealed it more recently than the cabin itself had been built. I circled around the side, and that's when I noticed the back window was open, the glass shattered inward. I hesitated, my stomach tightening, but then I crouched and looked inside. The interior smelled of mildew and old wood, mixed with something faintly metallic, almost like rust. The floor was covered in dust and dead leaves that must have blown in through the broken window. A small table sat in the corner with 2 chairs pushed away from it. The table had stains on it, dark spots that had soaked deep into the wood. I couldn't tell what they were, but they had spread unevenly, as if something heavy and wet had sat there long ago. There was a stove against the far wall, the kind that burned wood, its black pipe running up through the ceiling. Around it were piles of charred wood, some half-burnt, and a metal pot that was so corroded it looked fused to the stove's surface. Something about the room made me step back from the window, but I found myself moving to the back door, which hung slightly ajar. The lock had been broken long ago. I pushed it open carefully, and the hinges squealed. Inside, the floor creaked under my weight. Every step sent a puff of dust up into the air, and the stale smell grew stronger. There was no sign of anyone living there now, but there were signs that someone once had, and not in the distant past like I'd assumed. A mattress lay on the floor in one corner, with a dirty blanket bunched on top of it. The blanket had stains, some darker than others, and when I touched it with the tip of my boot, it left a small smudge on the fabric like grease. Next to the mattress was a pile of empty cans, the labels peeled off or faded. Some were stacked neatly, others tossed aside. I moved further into the cabin, and that's when I noticed the marks on the walls. At first, I thought they were scratches, maybe from furniture being moved, but when I leaned in closer, I saw they were carvings. Long, uneven lines dug deep into the wood. Some were just random slashes, but others formed shapes. Tall, narrow figures with arms and legs drawn over and over again in the same crude way. The more I looked, the more of them I saw. Dozens, maybe more, covering every wall I could see. My chest felt tight, and I had to steady myself against the door frame. I didn't know why, but those carvings bothered me more than anything else in that place. It wasn't just the act of making them, but the fact that someone had spent so much time doing it, covering every surface they could reach. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye near the corner. A small wooden box sat on the floor, partly hidden under the mattress. I crouched down and slid it out. The lid wasn't locked, and when I opened it, I saw a handful of things inside. An old pocket knife with a broken handle, a set of keys on a ring, a strip of cloth with dried brown stains on it, and a photograph. The photo was black and white, the edges frayed. It showed a man standing in front of what looked like the same cabin, only in better condition. The roof wasn't sagging, and the walls looked solid. The man wore a hat pulled low and heavy work clothes. His face was shadowed, hard to make out, but there was something about his stance, rigid, stiff. That unsettled me. I slid the photo back into the box and pushed it under the mattress again. I didn't want to carry it out with me. The air inside felt heavier the longer I stayed, and my skin itched like I was being watched, though I knew I wasn't. I backed out slowly, keeping my eyes on the room, and when I stepped outside, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The clearing was just as silent as before, but I noticed something different this time. Near the edge of the tree line, there was a patch of ground where the dirt had been disturbed. The soil was darker, looser, like it had been dug up and covered again. It wasn't wide, just a few feet across, but it was enough to send another chill through me. I didn't go closer. I didn't want to. I walked quickly back to my car, climbed in, and sat there gripping the wheel. The cabin looked even smaller from the driver's seat, but no less heavy, as if it carried some weight that pressed into the clearing around it. I started the engine and reversed back down the trail, branches scraping the sides again, the sound sharp and grating. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I didn't look back. In the years since, I've thought about that cabin more times than I'd like to admit. I never reported it to anyone. Maybe I should have, especially with that patch of disturbed soil and the carvings on the walls, but I told myself it was none of my business. People leave things behind in the woods all the time. Maybe it was just a relic of someone's private madness, a place they lived in when they had nowhere else to go. But every so often, late at night, I picture that photo. The man standing in front of the same cabin, upright and still, his face hidden in shadow. I wonder how long he stayed there, and if he ever left at all. And I wonder, too, what exactly is buried in the dirt behind that cabin. I started working as a seasonal park ranger back in the summer of 1998, stationed in a small national park in northern Montana. I was 24 then, still figuring out what I wanted to do with my life, and the job seemed like a perfect mix of being outdoors and earning a paycheck. The park itself was remote, a long stretch of thick pine forest with winding dirt roads, lakes that were still cold even in July, and cliffs that dropped straight into valleys filled with nothing but trees and silence. They put me in a ranger's cabin about a mile away from the main ranger station. It wasn't big, just one room with a stove, a small desk, a cot, and shelves lined with maps, radios, and worn field guides. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, and no neighbors. If something happened, the only way I could reach anyone was with the radio that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, depending on the weather. I thought I was fine with it. At first, the quiet felt good. My days were filled with hiking trails, checking signs, keeping an eye on campers, and watching for fire hazards. At night, I would return to the cabin, light the oil lamp, heat up canned food, and try to read before falling asleep. The silence pressed in from all sides after dark. It was a silence I had never known before. No cars in the distance, no hum of electricity, just the creaks of the wooden walls and the constant sound of the forest. By the middle of July, the days had grown hotter, but the nights stayed cold. That was when the first thing happened. I woke up one night to the sound of something dragging across the outside wall of the cabin. At first, I thought it was a branch scratching, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. I sat up on the cot, listening so hard my ears hurt, but there was nothing else. The forest was silent again. I told myself it was an animal, a deer rubbing against the wood or maybe a bear looking for food. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. There were marks on the wall, long, thin scrapes like something had been pulled slowly across the boards. I squatted down and ran my hand along them. They weren't deep, but they were too even to be claw marks, too straight to be random. I didn't know what to make of them. A week later, I found something else. I was hiking one of the back trails that cut through a narrow section of forest when I saw what looked like a fire ring off to the side. Campfires weren't allowed in that area, so I walked over to check. The ashes were cold, but there were boot prints around it and scraps of food packaging left behind. Whoever had been there hadn't followed the rules. I picked up the trash, kicked dirt over the ashes, and looked around. The prints led deeper into the trees, but I didn't follow. Something about the scene felt off, like whoever had been there hadn't been camping for fun. The fire ring was too small, the ashes too spread out, and there were no signs of a tent or sleeping bag. Just a quick fire, a meal, and then gone. That night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about those prints. They weren't the kind of boots most hikers wore. They were heavier, the kind you'd see on work sites or farms. And the way they circled the fire, it looked like someone had been pacing. The dragging sound came again a few nights later. This time, it started at the back wall and moved to the front, stopping near the door. I could hear the boards creak as if weight was leaning against them. I sat up in the dark, heart pounding, and reached for the rifle that leaned against the cot. My hands shook as I held it. The sound stopped, and the forest went still again. I waited for what felt like hours before sleep finally came in short bursts. The next day, I hiked the area around the cabin. 100 feet from the back wall, I found footprints. Heavy boots again. The ground was hard and dry, so the prints weren't sharp, but they were there, pressed into the dirt. They circled the cabin once and then disappeared into the trees. I followed them until they faded. I told myself it could have been another ranger, but deep down, I knew none of the others had reason to be out there at night. By August, I had stopped sleeping properly. Every creak in the wood, every gust of wind made me sit up and listen. My food supplies started to go faster because I was eating out of nerves. I kept the rifle closer than ever, and I checked the radio each night to make sure it still worked, though I knew it might not if I really needed it. One evening, near sunset, I hiked to the ridge a mile north of the cabin to watch for smoke from possible fires. From up there, I could see far into the valley, the trees stretching endlessly below. As I scanned, I noticed something strange. A thin column of smoke, not far from where I had found the first fire ring. It was too far from any campgrounds. I headed down the ridge, trying to get closer, but by the time I reached the area, the smoke was gone. What I found instead was a clearing with broken branches and boot prints. Someone had been there not long before, and they had left in a hurry. The prints led toward the direction of my cabin. That night, I locked the door for the first time since I'd arrived. The dragging sound didn't come, but I couldn't sleep. Every shadow seemed to move. The end came in late August. I returned from a long hike to find the cabin door standing open. I froze on the trail, rifle in hand, staring at the dark doorway. My first thought was that an animal had forced its way in, but the door hadn't been broken. It had been unlatched. Slowly, I stepped closer. Inside, nothing looked taken, but everything was wrong. My maps were scattered on the floor. The oil lamp had been moved to the opposite shelf. My pack was open, and the food inside had been rearranged, not stolen. Someone had been inside, looking, touching, but not taking. I stayed awake all night, rifle across my lap, lamp burning low, staring at the door. I didn't hear the dragging sound, but I felt eyes on the cabin the entire time. The next morning, I packed what I could carry and left. I didn't even radio it in until I was back at the main station. When I told the head ranger what had happened, he just frowned. He said they had seen signs of squatters before, people who lived in the woods to avoid being found. Sometimes hunters, sometimes drifters. They usually moved on after a while, but sometimes they lingered, watching. I quit at the end of the season and never went back. Even now, more than 20 years later, I can still hear that dragging sound against the cabin wall if I lie awake too long at night. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone was out there, walking the woods, circling the cabin, watching through the cracks in the boards while I slept. And the worst part is knowing they never really wanted my food or gear. They wanted to be close, close enough to hear me breathe, close enough to know I was alone. I was 36 years old the first time I decided to take a break from the city and spend some time alone in a cabin. It was the summer of 2009, early July, and the heat was suffocating in Chicago. I had been working 12-hour shifts at a factory, saving every extra dollar I could, and by the time vacation came around, I just wanted silence. I rented a small place up in northern Wisconsin, about 40 miles from the nearest town, tucked into the woods near a lake. It wasn't fancy, just a one-room cabin with a tin roof, a wood stove, a bed in the corner, and a table with 2 chairs. The kind of place that hadn't been updated in decades. The owner gave me directions that were nothing more than a series of landmarks. A gas station, a turn by a rusted silo, a dirt road that wound for 6 miles until the trees seemed to close in on both sides. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how isolated it felt. The nearest house wasn't even visible through the thick rows of pine. The only sound was the occasional cry of a bird and the wind moving through the branches. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, almost unnatural to someone used to sirens and car horns. The first day went smoothly. I unpacked my bags, stacked some firewood, and walked down to the edge of the lake. The water was dark, reflecting nothing but sky, and the shoreline was littered with reeds and driftwood. There were old fishing hooks stuck in the posts of the rotting dock, and the boards creaked under my weight. I remember standing there, thinking about how this was exactly what I had wanted. No noise, no people, no demands, just time to breathe. The second night is when I started feeling uneasy. I had cooked myself some simple food, canned chili heated on the stove, and turned in before midnight. The bed springs groaned every time I moved. The air was humid, and I left the small window cracked to let in a little breeze. I must have been asleep for only a couple of hours when I woke up to a noise outside. At first, I told myself it was an animal. That made sense. Plenty of deer, raccoons, even bears up here. But it wasn't the sound of leaves being brushed through or twigs snapping under hooves. It was slower, heavier, deliberate, like footsteps. I lay there on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening. The steps seemed to circle around the cabin once, maybe twice, then stopped. I waited, my body tense, until eventually, the woods went silent again. I must have drifted off after an hour, but when morning came, I didn't feel rested. I checked outside first thing. There were marks in the dirt, shoe prints leading from the tree line to the cabin. They weren't mine. The prints were larger, wider, and the ground was scuffed where someone had stopped by the window. That detail made my stomach drop. Whoever had been there hadn't just passed by. They had been looking in. I told myself not to panic. Maybe it was a hunter, someone passing through. Maybe they didn't realize anyone was staying in the cabin. I kept repeating those things as I went about the day, though every small sound in the woods made me twitch. That evening, I decided to make sure the door was locked and jammed a chair under the handle, just in case. I sat up longer than I wanted to, trying to read under the weak light of a lantern, until my eyes burned. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. The same slow, heavy footsteps. They came from the woods and stopped just outside the cabin. This time, whoever it was stayed longer. I could hear the crunch of dirt shifting under their weight, as if they were standing there only feet away, not moving. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might give me away. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. After what felt like forever, I caught the faint sound of the doorknob rattling, just once, then silence again. I sat in that bed, rigid, the blanket clutched up to my chin, until dawn finally bled through the trees. When I stepped outside in the daylight, the sight made my skin crawl. The prints were deeper now, clearer. Whoever it was had walked the perimeter, stopping at every window, even the one near the bed where I had been lying. There were fresh marks at the door, too. Scratches near the lock, like someone had tried to pry it open with a tool. That was the moment I realized it wasn't some hunter passing by. Someone was watching me, and they were trying to get in. I should have left then, but I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe the scratches were old. I stayed one more night against every ounce of instinct. I barricaded the windows with furniture and kept a heavy wrench by my bed. The third night was worse. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, closer, heavier, as if more than one person was moving outside this time. I stayed absolutely still, clutching the wrench in my hand, my ears ringing from the blood rushing through my head. The sound moved from window to window, a slow dragging pace, then stopped at the door. The handle turned, harder this time, rattling against the chair I had jammed underneath. My chest tightened as wood creaked and the chair legs scraped against the floor. For a split second, I thought the door would give way. Then suddenly, nothing. Silence. Whoever they were, they gave up or decided to wait. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept my eyes fixed on the door until morning light seeped in through the cracks. When I finally gathered the courage to go outside, I saw more prints, clearer than ever, and cigarette butts ground into the dirt near the porch. Fresh ones. Whoever was coming around wasn't just wandering. They had been watching, smoking, waiting. That was enough. I packed my bag in under 10 minutes, tossed everything into the trunk of my car, and sped out of there without looking back. The entire drive down the dirt road, I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting someone to step out into the path. When I finally reached the gas station back near town, I told the clerk about what had happened. He didn't look surprised. He said there had been reports before. People squatting in the woods, drifters watching cabins that got rented out. They never stayed in one place long enough for the sheriff to catch them. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't even bother asking for a refund for the nights I had left unused. The money didn't matter. What mattered was how close it had come, how easily things could have gone wrong if the lock had been weaker, if I had stayed just one more night. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I still hear phantom sounds outside my window. Heavy, slow steps in the alley below, the faint rattle of a handle. It's not real, I know that, but my body remembers. It remembers the silence of those woods, the prints in the dirt, the weight of someone unseen just outside the thin walls of that cabin. And it reminds me that out there in the dark, the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're people. I never thought I would be back on that road again. Years had passed since the divorce, and I had done everything I could to avoid that part of the county. It wasn't just him I wanted to stay away from. It was the whole stretch of land that seemed tied to him, the cabin he built, the dirt roads that led to it, and the way the trees leaned in too close over the gravel. It was the fall of 2018 when I found myself driving past it. I was 37 at the time, older, heavier, more tired, and definitely more cautious than I had been when I first met him. The divorce had left me with lines in my face and an uneasiness I carried everywhere. But what unsettled me the most that evening wasn't what I expected. The reason I was even out there was simple. I had taken a wrong turn on the way to a friend's house. The back roads twisted in a way I had forgotten, and with my phone losing signal, I had nothing but the dim headlights of my old silver Honda to guide me. When I realized where I was, my stomach tightened. That road, thin, cracked, scattered with fallen leaves, was leading straight past his old cabin. I could almost picture it in my head before it appeared. The front porch slanting a little, the wood darkened with age, the roof patched up in a way that always looked temporary. I hadn't seen it in nearly 7 years, but the image was carved into my memory like a scar. The air that night was cold enough to fog the windshield. I rolled the heater up higher, listening to the whir of the fan, trying not to focus on the dread rising in me. I told myself it was just a road, just a building, nothing more. But memories carry weight, and mine sat heavy in the pit of my stomach. When the cabin finally came into view, it was worse than I remembered. The wood looked more rotted, the porch sagged lower, and the yard around it was overgrown with weeds that seemed chest-high in places. No truck in the driveway, no lights on inside. The whole place looked dead, but not in a peaceful way. More like it had been left to rot, forgotten and ignored, yet somehow holding on. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I told myself to keep driving, but my eyes lingered on the cabin as I passed. That's when I noticed something that made me slow down without even realizing it. The front door was open, not wide open, but cracked, just enough that the darkness inside seemed to spill out like a shadow. That wasn't right. I knew the way he used to lock that door. He never left it open, not once. Even after we separated, I couldn't imagine him being careless like that. For a split second, I thought maybe he still lived there, maybe he was inside, drunk or passed out. But then I remembered he had moved out years ago. The cabin was supposed to be abandoned. I pulled the car over just ahead of the driveway. I didn't know why. Curiosity, maybe it was anger, maybe fear. I sat there with the engine idling, staring at that door. The weeds shifted slightly in the breeze, and the cabin gave off this feeling, like it was breathing. I told myself not to get out, not to do something stupid, but my hand was already reaching for the flashlight in the glove compartment. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I stepped out, the night air colder than it had felt inside the car. The sound of insects buzzed from the trees, but it was faint, quieter than usual for that time of year. I kept my light low, sweeping it across the driveway, across the front porch. The boards looked warped, and the rail on the left side leaned down, snapped at the bottom. My chest felt tight as I walked closer. The smell hit me first. Damp wood, mildew, and something else underneath it. Something sharp and sour like spoiled meat. I froze halfway up the porch steps, my light catching the edge of the open door. The darkness inside seemed thicker than it should have been, like the walls were swallowing it. My first instinct was to leave, but something made me push forward. Maybe I wanted proof. Proof that whatever had been inside my life for so long was really gone. Inside, the air was worse. Dust floated in the beam of my flashlight, but the sour smell cut through everything. The living room was empty except for an old chair tipped on its side, a cracked beer bottle next to it, and a pile of clothing that looked too damp to have been left only recently. I stepped carefully across the floorboards, which groaned under my weight. My heart was beating hard, but I forced myself to look around. The kitchen was a mess. Cabinets open, one of the drawers pulled out halfway, and a plate smashed on the ground. But what made me stop was the back door. Like the front, it wasn't shut all the way. It looked as if someone had gone in and out not long ago. That was when I knew I wasn't alone. The realization crept up on me slowly, like cold water seeping into my shoes. The cabin wasn't just abandoned. Someone was using it. Someone who didn't care about cleaning, about fixing, about shutting doors. My skin prickled at the thought. I backed toward the front, flashlight shaking in my hand. The silence inside was thick, heavier than anything I could describe. No creaks, no movement, nothing but my own breath. But I could feel it, eyes on me from somewhere deeper in the cabin. I didn't want to test the theory. I turned, nearly stumbling over the chair, and pushed through the front door back into the night air. I didn't run at first. I walked quickly down the steps, forcing myself to stay calm. But when I reached the gravel, I heard it. A faint shuffle like a foot dragging across wood inside. That was all it took. My legs moved faster than my brain, carrying me back to the car. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and jammed the key into the ignition. The headlights lit up the weeds in front of me, and in that brief moment before I drove away, I glanced back one last time. The front door was wider now, not just cracked open, but pushed halfway, like someone was standing there in the dark watching me leave. I drove until I hit the main road, my chest so tight I had to pull over just to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, sweat cold on my forehead. I didn't see anyone follow me, no car pulled out behind me, but the feeling stuck. The certainty that whoever was in there had seen me, had watched me, and had let me go. I never told anyone about it. Not my friends, not my family. It felt like something I wasn't supposed to share, like it belonged only to me and that cabin. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had gone further in, if I had opened one of the other doors in that house, or walked down into the basement. I never want to know, but every time I drive near that part of the county now, even miles away, I feel it again, the heaviness, the smell, the eyes in the dark. I know that cabin is still out there, and I know someone is still using it. The scariest part is how close I came to finding out who. The rain had been falling since the late afternoon, steady at first, then heavier as the sky sank into a deep gray. By the time night came, it was pouring hard enough that I couldn't see more than a few yards ahead of me. The road I'd been walking on had turned into a strip of mud, every step dragging my boots deeper into the ground. I was soaked through, even though I had a jacket on, and the cold air kept creeping under the layers. I had planned on reaching the small town about 5 miles further down, but I knew I wasn't going to make it. The rain had slowed me down, and the night made everything worse. That was when I saw the clearing. It wasn't much, just a patch where the trees thinned out. At first I thought it was nothing, but as I got closer I saw the faint shape of a roof and walls. A cabin. It looked small, not much bigger than a shed, but it was the only real shelter I had seen for hours. I pushed through the wet brush and walked up to it, my boots heavy with mud. The cabin looked old, maybe built decades ago, with rough wooden planks that had darkened with rain and age. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and the small porch was half rotted away. But it was standing, and it was dry inside. That was all I cared about in that moment. I pushed the door open. It didn't have a lock, just a warped wooden panel that gave after some effort. The inside smelled like damp wood and dust. The place was empty, except for a pile of old firewood stacked along one wall and a rusted iron stove in the corner. The floor was uneven, the boards creaking under my weight, and the windows were covered in grime so thick the moonlight barely filtered in. But it was shelter. I set my backpack down and shut the door tight. The sound of the rain muffled instantly, leaving just a dull roar on the roof. I dropped my wet jacket, wrung out some water from my sleeves, and started stacking wood in the stove. I had matches with me, and after a few tries, I got a small fire going. The flames lit up the room in a weak orange glow, casting shadows along the warped walls. I sat close to the stove, warming my hands, trying to ignore the way the wind rattled the loose boards of the cabin. The longer I sat, the more I started to notice the details of the place. There were faint marks on the walls, scratches, dents, places where someone had hammered nails long ago. The floorboards had stains, dark patches where the wood looked warped, maybe from water leaks. There was a small table in the corner, covered in dust, with the legs uneven and one corner broken. Everything about the place felt abandoned, forgotten, like no one had set foot in there for years. But it also felt lived in once, and that thought made me uneasy. The storm outside didn't let up. The wind picked up now and then, making the trees groan and the rain slap harder against the roof. I could hear the water dripping through somewhere in the back of the cabin, a steady drip into a puddle on the floor. The sound echoed faintly, and it made the cabin feel bigger than it really was. I told myself it was just a night. I'd rest there until morning, then continue down to the town. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't anything supernatural, just the knowledge that this cabin had belonged to someone once, and I was intruding. When I laid out my sleeping bag near the stove, I noticed something on the floor under the table. At first I thought it was just more debris, but when I crouched down, I saw it was a metal box, rusted but intact. I pulled it out and set it on the table. The box had a latch that had corroded, and it took some effort to pry it open with the edge of my knife. Inside were a few old items: a water-stained notebook, some photographs, and what looked like a hunting knife with the blade rusted to near uselessness. The notebook's pages were curled and hard to read, but I could make out scribbles, lists of supplies, small notes about weather, nothing more. The photographs were black and white, blurry, showing a man standing near the cabin and another of a woman holding a child. The images were worn, the faces hard to make out. I put the things back. It didn't feel right keeping them out. Whoever had lived there had left those behind, and it wasn't for me to disturb. But after finding the box, I couldn't stop thinking about them. The family in the photo, living in this small cabin, maybe decades ago. I wondered why they had left. The place wasn't livable now, not without repairs. Maybe they moved into town, maybe something else happened. As the hours passed, I tried to sleep, but the cabin didn't make it easy. Every creak of the wood, every rattle of the window made me open my eyes again. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, crunching on the wet ground. But when I sat up and listened, it was only the wind shifting the trees. I reminded myself I was alone. The town was miles away, and no one would bother coming out here in weather like this. Still, the thought made me grip my knife tight inside the sleeping bag. The rain finally eased a little in the early morning hours. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, and the cabin felt colder again. I decided I wouldn't waste time lingering. I packed up my things quickly, pulled my damp jacket back on, and stepped outside. The storm had left the ground slick and heavy, the trees dripping water all around me. The cabin looked even smaller in the daylight, its wood darker, more weathered, almost blending into the forest. I turned back once, looking at it, the way it sat crooked on the uneven ground. It wasn't much, but it had kept me dry through the night. As I started walking back toward the road, I thought about the box, the photos, the life that had been lived there. I thought about how strange it was that such places were scattered across the woods, forgotten, left to rot, yet still carrying pieces of the people who had built them. The cabin hadn't been haunted in the sense of ghosts. It was haunted by memory, by the fact that someone's whole life had once revolved around those four walls, and now it was just a shelter for someone like me caught in a storm. By the time I reached the road again, the sun was pushing through the clouds, and the storm had moved on. The town was still a long walk ahead, but I felt steadier now. The cabin had been unsettling, yes, but it reminded me that everything, even a lonely building in the woods, held its own story. Mine was just another night added to its history. And when I finally reached the town later that afternoon, muddy, tired, but dry enough, I didn't mention the cabin to anyone. I figured it was better that way. Some places are better left alone, remembered only by the people who once called them home, and by strangers who happen to stumble on them when the rain drives them out of the dark. I had never been the kind of person who got nervous about being alone in strange places. I was 35 years old, had worked construction for more than a decade, and had done jobs in half-finished buildings at night without a second thought. But when I agreed to stay at that small cabin near the edge of the old graveyard outside of Sheffield in the fall of 1997, I realized that I had underestimated how much a place itself could weigh on my nerves. The cabin wasn't even mine. A friend of mine, someone I worked with on roofing jobs, told me his uncle owned the land and used to live there until he passed away. The property was still standing, a little wooden structure tucked behind a line of twisted oak trees that separated it from the graveyard. They weren't new graves either. Most of the stones I could see from the back window had been there for over 100 years, weathered and leaning at angles like bad teeth. Some of them had completely lost their lettering, smoothed by rain and moss, while others had faint names that made me wonder what their lives were like in the 1800s. I went there because I wanted a few days of quiet. I was burned out from work, and my apartment was cramped with noise from the street below. My friend gave me the keys, said no one would bother me, and reminded me the cabin didn't have power anymore but still had a working fireplace. I packed food that didn't need cooking, a lantern, and a heavy jacket. I thought it would be peaceful. The first night I arrived, I noticed how quiet it really was. Not the usual kind of quiet where you still hear distant cars or dogs barking. This was dead quiet. The trees blocked off the wind, and the graveyard stretched out like a flat patch of silence behind the cabin. The air smelled of damp dirt and leaves, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes. The cabin itself was simple. One main room, a small kitchen with shelves that still held rusted tins, and a bedroom that had only a narrow bed with a thin mattress. The walls were stained from years of smoke from the fireplace. The floor creaked under every step. I set my bag down, lit the lantern, and sat for a while, listening to the building groan as it adjusted to the evening chill. At first it felt fine, but when I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the windows made the place too open. There were no curtains, just bare glass, and from the bed I could see straight out into the graveyard through the side window. In the dark, the gravestones looked taller, sharper, like they were standing at attention. I pulled my jacket over my head and forced myself to sleep. I woke around 3 in the morning to the sound of something tapping. At first, I thought it was branches hitting the cabin, but the oaks were too far back for that. I held still, letting my ears adjust, and realized it was coming from the window. Slow, uneven taps like something brushing against the glass. I stayed in bed, my chest tight, listening. The sound stopped after maybe 10 minutes, though it felt longer. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a bird or something caught on the sill. Still, I couldn't fall back asleep. I just stared into the dark until the faint blue of dawn crept in. The next morning, I walked outside and checked the window. The glass was smudged, streaked with what looked like dirt. There were also faint scratches near the bottom of the frame, shallow but fresh. I bent down, ran my finger along them, and told myself a raccoon or fox must have been trying to get in. That made sense. That was reasonable. I shook it off during the day by walking the land. The graveyard stretched further than I expected. Rows and rows of stones, many sinking into the ground. The soil there felt softer under my boots, uneven. I noticed newer plots in the far corner, ones from the 1970s and 1980s. A small maintenance shed sat near those, padlocked and covered in ivy. I kept walking, trying to convince myself it was just a place like any other. But when I got back to the cabin, I realized I hadn't heard a single bird all day, not even crows, which seemed strange for a place with so many trees. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it was sharper, quicker, as if something was impatient. I sat up in bed, the lantern still burning low, and stared at the window. I couldn't see anything outside except my own reflection and the faint outline of the stones. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. The sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more erratic. Finally, I grabbed the lantern and forced myself to step closer. The tapping stopped the second I reached the glass. I stood there, frozen, holding the lantern up, but the outside was empty. Just the graveyard, still and silent. When I woke in the morning, After drifting in and out of shallow sleep, I saw something that made me feel colder than the air itself. On the dirt just beneath the window were footprints, bare feet pressed into the mud, leading back toward the graveyard. The prints were fresh, they were clear, and they weren't mine. I didn't waste time. I packed my bag, though part of me wanted to leave everything behind and just run. My hands shook as I stuffed my jacket inside and doused the lantern. I couldn't understand how someone would walk barefoot through that ground in the middle of the night. It didn't make sense. I stepped outside, ready to leave the place behind, when I noticed something else. The cabin door frame had a new set of scratches, higher up than the ones on the window. Deep, jagged marks like someone had dragged something sharp across the wood. They hadn't been there the day before. The walk back to the main road felt longer than it should have. Every step I took, I felt like someone was watching me from behind the trees or from between the tilted stones. My ears strained for sound, but the silence pressed harder the further I went. My bag felt too heavy. My legs felt too slow. When I finally reached the road and saw my car parked in the gravel pull-off, I didn't look back. I shoved my bag in the seat, started the engine, and drove until the graveyard and the cabin were nothing but a blur in the rearview mirror. I never went back. I never even asked my friend about it. I just told him thanks, but that I wouldn't be using the cabin again. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every small noise outside my window at home made my skin crawl. I never figured out what it was that stood outside that cabin, tapping on the glass and leaving prints in the mud. Maybe someone was living out there, using the graveyard to hide. Maybe someone knew people wouldn't check that land often. What I do know is that it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't just my nerves. Something real was there, close enough to touch the glass while I lay in bed, close enough to leave its mark in the mud. And the thought that it watched me for hours, maybe both nights, is something I still can't shake, even decades later. I had been driving all afternoon with my dog, a big shepherd mix named Duke, the kind of dog that didn't leave my side no matter where I went. The trip wasn't supposed to be long, just a quiet weekend at an old rental cabin tucked deep into the woods of northern Minnesota. It was early fall 2007, and the trees had already started to turn, their bright orange and yellow leaves standing out against the gray skies. The weather felt colder than usual for that time of year, the kind of damp cold that clung to your skin and made your clothes feel heavy. By the time I turned off the main road, the sun was already dipping low. The cabin was another 10 miles down a dirt trail that narrowed with each passing mile. The branches from both sides of the road reached over like arms, scratching at the roof of my truck as I drove through. My headlights barely seemed to cut through the gloom, and the deeper I went, the quieter everything became. Duke sat up straight in the passenger seat, his ears perked, like he didn't trust where we were going. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked smaller than I expected. It was just a single-room place with a porch that sagged on one side, its wood dark from years of weather beating down on it. Behind it, the woods stretched endlessly. I could see the faint outline of a lake down the slope, the water dark and still, reflecting none of the last light left in the sky. I killed the engine and sat there for a minute. Duke whined softly, staring at the tree line. It was too quiet, not just the normal woods quiet, but the kind where even the insects and birds seemed to hold their breath. I told myself it was just the season, maybe the colder air keeping the animals down. Still, as I stepped out, I kept looking around like someone might be standing there, just far enough back to stay hidden. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old pine. The floorboards groaned with every step I took. There was no electricity, just a couple of lanterns left behind and a wood stove in the corner. I set my bag down on the cot, unrolled my sleeping bag, and went back out to get firewood. Duke followed me, staying close, his nose working overtime as he sniffed at the edges of the clearing. By the time I got a fire going inside, it was fully dark. The rain started not long after, first as a light drizzle and then heavier, the drops drumming against the roof. The sound was steady, almost calming, and I tried to relax, telling myself this was the point of the trip, to get away from noise, from people, from everything. I heated up a can of soup, shared a little with Duke, and stretched out on the cot. But the peace didn't last. Around midnight, Duke sat up, his whole body stiff. His ears pointed straight at the door, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. I sat up too, instantly alert. The rain had stopped, but the woods outside weren't silent. I could hear something, soft footsteps crunching over wet leaves, slow and deliberate. Not an animal running, not random movement. Someone walking. I turned down the lantern, leaving just a faint glow. My heart was hammering, but I forced myself to sit still, listening. The steps circled the cabin, pausing now and then, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were out there. Duke's growl grew louder, his teeth bared, his eyes locked on the door. Minutes dragged by. I thought maybe it was a hunter or someone lost, but the longer it went on, the less that made sense. Why would anyone be out here at this hour, in the rain, circling a cabin without saying anything? My shotgun was propped in the corner, and I quietly reached for it, not wanting to make a sound. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. I didn't move, just sat there with the shotgun across my lap, my ears straining. Duke stayed rigid, every muscle tense. Then, faintly, came the sound of wood tapping against wood. Not knocking, not random. A slow, steady tap on the side of the cabin, just below the window. Then again, and again. I thought about yelling out, but something in me held back. Instead, I waited, counting each tap until it stopped. Then nothing, just silence and the sound of my own breathing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in that cot with the shotgun in hand, Duke beside me, both of us staring at the door until the faint gray of dawn crept through the window. When morning finally came, I stepped outside. The ground was soaked, the air cold and heavy. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for tracks. At first I didn't see anything, but then, in the mud just a few feet from the porch, I found them.
Bootprints.
Not hiking boots, but heavier work-style boots. They circled the cabin, stopping beneath the window, just like I'd heard. The strangest part was how fresh they looked. The edges were sharp, pressed deep into the soft mud. Whoever it was had been there, close, standing in the dark while I sat just feet away. I packed up quickly after that. I didn't bother with breakfast, just shoved everything back into the truck and got Duke inside. My hands shook as I loaded the shotgun in the passenger seat next to me. I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me leave. The drive back down that narrow trail felt endless. Every shadow looked like a person. Every branch against the truck made me jump. When I finally reached the main road, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I never went back to that cabin again. Later, I looked it up online, tried to find if anyone else had written about strange things happening there. But there was nothing. No stories, no reports, nothing about trespassers or break-ins. Just an old rental cabin on the edge of a forgotten lake. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw in that mud. Someone had been there, close enough to touch the walls, close enough to look in through the window if they wanted. They hadn't tried to break in, hadn't spoken a word. Just walked, circled, tapped, and left before morning. The thought that stayed with me the most wasn't who it was or why they were there. It was the fact that they knew exactly where I was, exactly what I was doing, and they chose not to show themselves. They wanted me to know they were out there, and that was worse than anything else. Even now, years later, whenever I hear Duke growl low at nothing, I can't help but think back to that night in the cabin, with the rain on the roof and footsteps in the dark. I drove up to the mountains in northern Arizona in the fall of 2006. I was 30 years old then, restless, tired of the city noise, and wanted a week away from everything. A friend of mine had an old cabin out near Winslow, far enough from paved roads that you had to drive a pickup on gravel for almost an hour before reaching it. The place wasn't fancy, just a single-room wooden cabin with a fireplace, a cot, a table, and a small shed out back. He told me I could use it whenever I wanted, so I packed up food, water, and a rifle for safety. I thought the week would just be me, quiet woods, and some peace of mind. The first night was calm. The air was sharp and cold, the sky full of stars you couldn't see back in town. The silence out there was heavy, broken only by the wind moving through the trees. I slept well, even with the strange creaks of the old boards and the scratching of pine branches against the cabin's side. The second night, things felt different. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't an animal noise I recognized, more like footsteps dragging in the dirt, slow, uneven. I lay still on the cot, listening hard. At first I thought it could be a deer or maybe a stray dog, but the steps sounded too deliberate, like someone walking but trying to be quiet. I held my breath and reached for the rifle I kept near the bed. The noise lasted a few minutes, then faded into the woods. I stayed awake for hours after, staring at the ceiling in the dark. In the morning, I went outside and looked around. There were marks in the dirt near the shed. Not full footprints, but smudges, like something heavy had pressed into the soil. I convinced myself it was just animals nosing around, maybe coyotes. I tried to brush it off, cooked breakfast, and went for a hike. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Out there, miles from anyone, you start to realize how alone you are and how little help would come if something went wrong. By the third night, the unease turned into dread. I had been reading by lantern light when I heard it again. Footsteps outside. This time they circled the cabin. Slow, steady steps crunching the dirt and leaves. I froze, barely breathing. Whoever or whatever it was stopped by the window. I turned the lantern down low and sat in the dark, gripping the rifle, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. The steps moved again, pausing at the door, then the back wall, then gone. I waited, sitting stiff in the silence, until dawn began to lighten the cracks around the shutters. When I stepped outside that morning, the marks in the dirt were clearer. Footprints, bare feet, wide and long, like someone walking without shoes. The thought of a barefoot stranger wandering in the cold around my cabin in the middle of the night made my stomach turn. I checked the shed and found its old lock broken, though nothing inside seemed touched. It looked like someone had just forced it open to see what was in there. I didn't know what to do. I thought about leaving, but the idea of driving miles through empty dirt roads with someone possibly following me seemed worse. I decided to stay one more night, keep the fire low, and listen. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark with the rifle across my lap, the lantern out, the only light coming from faint moonlight through the cracks. Hours dragged by. Then I heard it again, movement but different this time. Not circling, approaching. Slow crunches in the dirt coming straight toward the door. Then silence. I could hear my own breath, the creak of the wood as I shifted my weight, the faint ticking of the lantern cooling beside me. Then came the sound that froze me in place. Scratching on the door. Fingernails or something sharp dragging across the wood. Long, slow scratches like someone testing the surface. I wanted to call out, to shout, but my throat locked up. The scratching stopped. Then the handle rattled gently, like someone trying it, careful not to be loud. I raised the rifle and aimed at the door, ready, but the latch held. After a minute, the sound faded. The steps moved off, disappearing into the woods again. I sat there until dawn, too afraid to move. the rifle still tight in my hands. By morning, I made my decision. I wasn't going to wait for another night. I packed my gear fast, loaded the truck, and was ready to get out. But when I walked to the shed to grab the last of my supplies, I froze. Inside, on the dusty floor, were more prints, bare feet. But these weren't just walking in, they were crouched low, like someone had been sitting in the corner watching. The thought of that while I had been inside trying to stay quiet, someone had been hiding just yards away in the shed, sent a cold shiver through me that I still can't fully explain. I slammed the shed door shut, didn't bother locking it, and started the truck. As I drove down that endless dirt road, every shadow between the trees felt like it was moving. Every glance in the rearview mirror made me expect to see someone following. I didn't stop until I hit the paved road near Winslow. Only when I saw other cars did I finally breathe. Back in town, I told myself it had to be some drifter, maybe someone living rough in the woods trying to scare me or steal food. But the thing that still unsettles me is how deliberate it all felt. Not like random theft, not like a hungry stranger, but like someone who wanted me to know they were there. Someone who wanted me afraid. I never went back to that cabin. My friend later asked if I'd used it, and I just said yes, but didn't explain why I wouldn't again. Even now, years later, I can still hear the scratching on that door in the middle of the night, that slow sound of nails dragging across the wood, like it was marking its presence. Every time I think about it, I picture the prints in the shed, crouched low, waiting, and I know I made the right choice leaving when I did. Out there in the middle of nowhere, it doesn't matter if you call it a skinwalker, a stranger, or just something unexplainable. What matters is that it was real, and it was watching me. The road had turned into nothing more than a muddy trail by the time I reached the cabin. My truck's tires slipped more than once on the narrow path, and I had to fight the wheel just to keep it steady. The cabin sat at the edge of the woods in northern Montana, about 20 miles from the nearest small town. It was October of 1998, cold enough that I could see my breath when I stepped out of the truck, but not cold enough for snow yet. The air was damp and heavy, and the smell of pine needles and wet dirt hung everywhere. I had borrowed the hunting cabin from a man I knew through work. His family had owned the place for years, though he said nobody in the family came out much anymore. He told me it was sturdy, a bit rough, but perfect for a weekend alone. That was exactly what I wanted. I had been working long shifts at a warehouse and wanted quiet. No phones, no noise, no one bothering me. Just a rifle, some hunting gear, and the silence of the woods. The cabin itself looked older than I expected. The roof sagged in the middle, and one of the shutters on the front window hung crooked, banging lightly against the wall in the wind. The wood was dark, water-stained from years of rain, and the steps leading to the porch creaked like they were ready to give way. The lock on the door was an old rusted padlock, but the key my coworker gave me worked fine. Inside, the air smelled like dust and mice. The cabin was one large room with a small wood stove in the corner, a metal bed frame with a thin mattress, and a table that leaned slightly to one side. There were racks on the wall where rifles used to hang, though now they were empty. A few old hunting magazines sat in a stack on the floor, their pages curled yellow at the edges. The only light came from two small windows and the lantern I brought with me. I spent the first hour sweeping away leaves and dirt that had blown in through the cracks. I stacked some firewood inside, checked the stove, and set up my sleeping bag on the bed frame. By the time the sun dropped, the forest outside had grown unnervingly quiet. Even the usual noises, birds, insects, seemed thin. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The cabin shifted with the wind, and I kept hearing things outside. Branches snapping, the crunch of leaves like something heavy moving around. I told myself it was deer. The forest was full of them, and I came here to hunt, so it made sense. Still, lying there in the dark, Every creak of the wood and every sound outside made my stomach knot up. By morning, I shook it off. The air was sharp and cold when I stepped out onto the porch. Mist clung low to the ground, weaving between the trees. I loaded my rifle and walked into the woods, following a narrow game trail that twisted through the pines. I spent most of the day out there, moving slow, stopping to listen, scanning the ground for tracks. I saw a few does at a distance, but nothing close enough for a shot. When I got back to the cabin late in the afternoon, I noticed something strange. The ground near the porch had deep marks in the mud. First, I thought it was a bear, but the spacing was odd. Too wide for a bear, too long for a deer. Almost like boot prints, except heavier, pressed deeper into the soil. My own tracks were there too, but these others circled the porch once, then disappeared back into the trees. I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe another hunter had wandered through, though this far out that seemed unlikely. I sat inside that evening with the stove going, eating from a can of beans and listening to the forest. Every now and then I caught a sound outside, movement too heavy for a small animal, too steady to be the wind. When the sun went down, I made sure the door was bolted. That night I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I heard footsteps outside. Not running, just slow, steady crunches in the leaves. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. I didn't light the lantern. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was awake. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my rifle across my lap, until the faint gray light of dawn crept through the window. The next morning, I checked around the cabin again. More prints in the mud, this time clearer. They were boots, definitely boots, large ones. The tread was deep, like military or work boots. They led out toward the tree-line, but after a few yards, they scattered and vanished on the harder ground. I thought about leaving right then, packing up, driving back to town. But part of me didn't want to look weak. It was just a stranger passing through. I told myself, nothing more. I went out hunting again, but I couldn't focus. Every sound behind me made me whip my head around. By the time I returned to the cabin, I was exhausted from nerves more than from walking. That night was the worst. I had built up the fire in the stove and tried to settle in, but the noises outside grew louder. Twigs breaking, leaves crunching, a deliberate sound. Not the random shuffle of an animal. Something was moving around the cabin, circling it again and again. At one point, I heard the porch steps groan like weight had been put on them. I held my rifle tight, sweat dripping down my back despite the cold. Hours passed like that. Then, just before dawn, the sound stopped. Completely. The silence was heavier than the noise. I waited until the sun was fully up before I dared open the door. What I saw froze me in place. On the porch, right in front of the door, was a pile of dead rabbits. 6 of them, their necks twisted, bodies laid neatly in a row. They hadn't been shot or eaten, just broken and placed there. I stepped back inside, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped the rifle. That was it for me. I packed everything as fast as I could, stuffed my gear into the truck, and didn't bother cleaning up. When I slammed the truck door and turned the key, the engine coughed twice before roaring to life. As I pulled away, I looked once in the mirror. Just at the edge of the trees, far back in the shadows, I caught the shape of someone standing. Tall, broad, still as stone, watching. I couldn't see the face, but I knew it wasn't a trick of light. Whoever had been circling the cabin all night was standing there, waiting, like they wanted me to know I'd been watched the whole time. I drove until the cabin and trees vanished behind me. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. My hands didn't steady until I was back in town, parked outside a gas station under the buzzing lights. I never told my coworker what happened. I just handed him the key and said thanks. He probably thought I had a good weekend out there. I didn't explain that I'd left most of my gear behind, or that I barely slept, or that I'll never set foot in that part of Montana again. What scared me most wasn't just that someone was out there. It was how careful they were, how deliberate. They didn't try to break in. They didn't yell or rush me. They just circled, waited, and left their message on the porch. That pile of broken animals was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. The cabin was theirs, not mine, and they wanted me gone. I made sure to listen. I had been driving for hours that day, moving along the back roads of northern Minnesota in late October of 1996. The trees were already stripped bare, the branches thin and crooked against a pale sky, and the air had that kind of sharp cold that bites into your nose every time you inhale. I had rented a small cabin tucked far back in the woods, a place that was supposed to give me some peace for a few days after a long run of work and stress. It sat alone, about a mile from the nearest dirt road, reachable by a narrow path that my truck barely fit down. The cabin wasn't much, just a squat one-room building with a loft above, old wood siding, and a porch that sagged in the middle. I didn't care about the looks. What I wanted was quiet. I got there in the afternoon, unloaded some supplies, stacked some firewood inside, and tried to settle in. The air inside smelled of old pine and damp stone, but after a few minutes with the fire burning, it warmed up and felt almost cozy. I set my bag down, unrolled my sleeping bag on the old bed in the corner, and just sat there listening to the fire crack. By dusk, the woods outside had turned darker than I expected. The clouds were thick, hiding the moon, and without streetlights, the blackness pressed in around the cabin windows. I walked out onto the porch once before I settled for the night. The trees made the kind of creaking sounds you hear when the wind pushes through them, and the ground was covered in dead leaves that shifted in little bursts like something moving, even though I saw nothing. It was unsettling in a way I couldn't explain, so I went back inside and bolted the door. That night, I woke up to a sound that made my stomach tighten. At first, I thought it was the wind pushing branches against the cabin, but the more I lay still, the clearer it became. It was the sound of leaves crunching under steady steps, slow and careful, circling. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the room lit in a faint orange glow, and I just stared at the ceiling while every nerve in my body screamed at me to get up. I told myself it could have been a deer, maybe even a raccoon, but I knew how animals sounded when they moved. This was different. The steps were deliberate, one after another, like someone was testing how quiet they could be. I forced myself to crawl toward the window on the far side of the room. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would give me away. The glass was streaked with condensation, but I wiped a corner clean and peered out. The yard was empty, just darkness and the faint shape of trees. But as I pressed my face to the glass, I saw it. Something shift just beyond the tree line. A figure, still, waiting. I backed away from the window and gripped the hatchet I'd brought for chopping firewood. My hands were sweating against the wooden handle, and I just crouched in the corner listening. The steps started again, moving along the side of the cabin, brushing against the walls in places, then fading, then returning. I could picture whoever it was circling, maybe looking for a way inside. The night dragged on with me wide awake, staring at the door, the windows, the dark loft above. Every creak of the old cabin sounded sharper than usual, like the whole place was betraying me by making noise. Finally, the steps stopped. I never heard them walk away, but the woods outside went still, and eventually, sometime near dawn, exhaustion pulled me into a restless sleep. When I woke in the morning, the first thing I did was check the ground outside. My boots sank into the wet earth, and I scanned the area around the cabin. At first, I didn't see much, but then I spotted them. Prints in the mud mixed with the leaves. Human prints. Not boots, not shoes, just bare feet. They circled the cabin, clear as day, even pausing near the back window and the porch. The hair on my arms rose as I traced them with my eyes. Whoever it was had been barefoot in the cold, walking slow and steady around me while I was inside. I wanted to pack up right then and there, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was some local who wandered too far. Maybe a drunk who got lost. It didn't make sense, but I tried to force it into something less terrifying. I spent that day chopping more wood, keeping busy, trying to push it out of my head. But every time I looked toward the trees, I expected to see someone standing there again. That night, I didn't even try to sleep at first. I sat by the fire with the hatchet across my lap and a lantern burning beside me. The hours crawled, and I thought maybe nothing would happen. But then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The crunch of leaves, the careful steps. This time, they didn't circle. The steps came straight toward the porch, then stopped just outside the door. I held my breath so hard my chest ached. The handle of the door rattled once, then again. Whoever it was tried to turn it slow, like they thought I might not notice. My throat went dry, and I gripped the hatchet so tight my knuckles hurt. The door didn't open, the bolt held. After a long silence, the steps moved away, but I couldn't tell where. Minutes later, there was a thud on the roof, soft but clear, like someone had climbed up. Dust fell from the beams above me. I stared at the loft ladder, half expecting them to drop down from the dark. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to stay where I was until morning light finally crept through the cracks in the shutters. When I stepped outside at dawn, my stomach dropped. The prints were everywhere again, circling, leading to the porch, then back toward the woods. And there were handprints this time, smeared across the windows, pale and dirty, like someone had pressed their face against the glass to look in. That was enough. I shoved everything into my bag, loaded the truck, and left that cabin without looking back. The whole drive down the narrow path, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half sure I'd see someone barefoot walking behind me. I never went back to that cabin. I never even told anyone the full story. But I still remember the sound of those steps in the leaves, slow and patient, circling me in the dark. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know they were out there, and that was the worst part. It wasn't about breaking in. It was about the waiting, the watching. And even now, years later, sometimes when I wake up at night, I swear I can still hear it. The crunch of leaves outside, steady and careful, moving closer. I had rented a small cabin on the edge of the Peak District in England, just outside a quiet village that didn't seem to have much more than a pub, a small shop, and a handful of houses. The year was 2017, and I had just turned 34. I booked the place because I wanted a week away from everything. The office, the noise of the city, the constant push of people on the streets. The pictures online made the cabin look simple but decent. Wooden walls, a small stove, a bed, and a table. It sat at the far end of a dirt lane with no neighbors in sight. That was exactly what I wanted, silence and space. I arrived in early October, when the air had just begun to feel sharp and the leaves were starting to fall in patches of yellow and brown. The owner had left the keys under a stone by the door. When I stepped inside, it smelled faintly of damp wood, as though it had been closed up for a while. The floor creaked with each step, and the windows were streaked with rain from the previous night. It wasn't fancy at all, but I wasn't looking for fancy. I unpacked my bag, lit the small stove, and sat down to breathe in the quiet. The first night passed without much. I heard some wind rushing against the cabin, branches scraping against the side, and the odd fox bark in the distance. That didn't bother me. I had grown up in the countryside, so those sounds felt familiar. What did bother me was how dark it became once the sun dropped. There were no streetlights, no glow from other houses, just pitch black pressing against the thin curtains. Even stepping outside to bring in some firewood felt unnerving. The silence was so heavy it seemed to swallow everything. On the third night, I saw her. I had been sitting at the table with a mug of tea, writing in a notebook. I remember looking up at the window above the sink. The reflection of the room made it hard to see, but beyond that, in the faint light of the moon, there was a figure, a woman. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, near the treeline, facing directly toward the cabin. I froze, staring hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but she didn't move. She stood there in what looked like a long coat or maybe a dress, her posture straight, her face pale against the darkness. I blinked a few times, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, she was gone. My heart hammered, but I told myself it could have been a trick of the light, a branch, even just my tired mind. I shut the curtains and tried to ignore it, though the thought lingered. I didn't sleep much that night. The following day, I walked into the village to clear my head. The walk took about 40 minutes along a damp country lane that curved through hedgerows and fields. At the shop, I picked up bread, milk, and a few other things. I almost asked the shopkeeper if there were any odd stories about the woods near my cabin, but I stopped myself. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I convinced myself again that what I saw was nothing. That night, I made a simple dinner, read a few chapters of a book, and went to bed early. Around midnight, I woke up. The stove had gone out, and the air inside was cold. At first, I lay there in the darkness, listening. The cabin was silent, except for the occasional drip of water outside. Then I heard crunching, footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the clearing outside. My skin prickled, and I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped, and after a long silence, I gathered enough courage to get out of bed and walk quietly to the window. I pulled the curtain back just a fraction. She was there again, closer this time, standing just beyond the woodpile, maybe 20 feet away. Her face was pale, her hair long and dark, her clothes hanging loose as if they were too big. Even in the dim light, I could see she was staring at the cabin. Not moving, just staring. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, until finally I forced myself to shut the curtain again. I didn't dare look back out. I sat awake for the rest of the night, every sound amplified, my body tense. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside cautiously. There were faint impressions in the damp ground, footprints, small, narrow ones. They led from the treeline to the woodpile and back again. I couldn't explain it anymore as imagination. Someone had been there, some woman. But why? Who? There were no houses nearby, no reason for anyone to walk out there in the middle of the night. I thought about packing up and leaving, but a stubborn part of me refused. I told myself I would stay one more night and then decide. That evening, I locked the door, checked it twice, and even stacked a chair under the handle. I sat at the table with a knife from the kitchen, my hands sweating. Hours passed. The night stretched on. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps. Slow, closer. My throat went dry. I didn't move this time. I just sat there, holding my breath. Then I heard it, a tap, soft on the window, just once. Then another.
Top.
I gripped the knife tighter, every muscle in my body rigid. I couldn't bring myself to look. The tap stopped, and after a long silence, I forced myself to peek. She was right there, her face almost pressed against the glass. Pale skin, eyes wide, lips parted. She looked directly at me. My stomach lurched and I stumbled back. When I looked again, she was gone. I didn't sleep at all. The moment daylight came, I packed everything. I didn't bother tidying up or leaving a note for the owner. I threw my bag into the car and drove. I didn't stop in the village. I didn't stop until I reached the motorway. My hands shook the entire way. Later that week, When I was back home, I searched online for anything about that area. I found a short mention on an old forum about a woman who used to live in those woods decades ago, a recluse who rarely came into the village. Some said she wandered at night, but there were no details, nothing solid. Maybe it was just old gossip. Maybe the woman I saw was someone else entirely. Maybe she was living rough in the woods. I don't know, but I know what I saw. I know the sound of footsteps, the sight of her face against the glass, the way she stood watching the cabin in the dark. It's been years since then, but I still see her when I close my eyes. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, half expecting to hear those slow footsteps outside my window. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Some silences aren't peaceful. They're waiting, heavy, hiding something just beyond the edge of the trees. And once you've seen someone standing there in that silence, you can't forget it. I was 29 the summer I agreed to take care of my uncle's farm out in rural Nebraska. He had left for a few months to stay with his daughter in Colorado after surgery, and he needed someone to keep an eye on the livestock, the crops, and the old cabin he used as his main house. I had been between jobs, restless in the city, so I volunteered. The farm sat about 3 miles off the main road, nothing but gravel paths, cornfields, and wide flat land around it. The cabin wasn't modern. It had a tin roof patched in spots, with siding faded gray from decades of wind and sun, and windows that rattled in their frames when the storms rolled through. The first week was quiet. I fixed fences, checked on the cows, watered the small garden near the cabin. The days were long and hot, and the nights carried that silence you only get in the countryside. I slept on a cot in the corner of the cabin, under a ceiling fan that barely spun, its blades clicking like a metronome. Around the second week, I started noticing small things. At first, it was nothing unusual. A tool missing from where I left it, a shed door open when I was sure I had latched it, feed bins disturbed in ways that didn't make sense. I blamed myself. I was tired, unorganized, adjusting to a new routine. But one morning I found a dead chicken behind the barn. Its neck was broken clean, no blood, no sign of a coyote or raccoon, just snapped and tossed aside. The coop door was closed and latched. I remember standing over it, the air still cool from the night, the fields quiet, and feeling something uneasy settle in my chest. That night I made sure to lock up everything: coop, barn, sheds. I even wedged a stick in the sliding barn door to keep it shut. I went inside, had a simple dinner, and tried to read under the weak cabin light. By midnight, I heard it, footsteps in the gravel outside. Slow, steady, crunching like someone heavy was circling the cabin. I turned off the lamp and sat still in the dark, my heart beat loud in my ears. The steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other, dragging a little, as if whoever it was wore boots too big for them. I didn't have a gun with me, just a rusted old axe leaning by the door. I stayed frozen, gripping the cot frame until my hands ached. Eventually, the sound stopped. The silence was even worse. I didn't sleep until daylight pushed through the thin curtains. The next day, I checked the property. Nothing was missing, nothing broken. No tracks I could clearly make out in the hard dirt, but the stick I had wedged into the barn door was gone, just gone. Each night after that, the noises came back. Sometimes footsteps, sometimes scraping against the walls, once what sounded like breathing outside the window. I couldn't see much through the glass at night, only my own reflection in the dark. The livestock grew restless too. Cows pacing, horses stamping at night for no reason. I tried to convince myself it was some drifter, maybe someone camping in the cornfields, stealing food, but they never took anything obvious. They just lingered. By the third week, I was running on little sleep, every sound setting me on edge. I stopped going into town for groceries because I didn't like leaving the cabin alone. I ate what was in the pantry, old canned beans and dry bread, keeping the windows shut and doors locked even in the day. One night, I woke up to the cabin door handle rattling. Slow at first, then harder, as if someone was testing the lock. I slid off the cot, crept to the corner, clutching that axe so tight the wood dug into my palms. The rattling went on for minutes, then silence again. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, I caught a shadow slipping back toward the barn. Too tall, too thin, moving strange, shoulders hunched forward. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I found muddy prints by the barn, barefoot, long, narrow feet, toes spread out deep in the dirt. Whoever it was had been standing there for a while. I stopped going out after dark. I stayed inside with every window locked, every curtain drawn, the axe always closed. The farm felt less like open space and more like a trap. Each sound outside grew louder in my head. Every night stretched longer. Then came the last night. The wind was low, the air heavy with humidity, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I sat up on the cot, eyes on the door, when I heard the barn creak open. Not the animals, the heavy sliding door I always secured. I knew I had locked it that evening. The sound of it grinding along the rail made my stomach turn cold. I waited, listening. Then came the sound of steps across the yard. Slow, deliberate, gravel crunching closer and closer until it stopped right outside the cabin door. I could hear breathing through the thin wood. Long inhales, slow exhales. Whoever it was just stood there, inches away on the other side. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. But when the handle rattled again, something in me snapped. I lunged forward, swung the axe, and buried it into the door just above the knob. The sound outside stopped instantly. No more breathing, no more movement, just silence. I stayed like that the rest of the night, gripping the axe, staring at the broken door. The sun rose, and when I finally stepped outside, the yard was empty. But the barn door stood wide open, the lock pried off and tossed into the dirt. Inside, nothing was stolen, just hay tossed around, tools moved, like someone had been living in there. I packed that morning. I left the animals with feed and water enough for a few days and drove straight back to the city. When my uncle asked later why I had left early, I didn't tell him the truth. I just said something came up. But I'll never forget those nights on the farm. The sound of boots in the gravel, the breathing outside the door, the barefoot prints by the barn. I never saw a face, never caught them in the act. But they were there watching, testing, waiting. And what unsettles me most, even now years later, is that they never wanted the animals or the tools or even me gone. They just wanted me awake. They wanted me afraid. I had been driving for hours that day, heading through the back roads of Montana in late October. The air was sharp and dry, and the trees were already bare, their limbs like black veins stretched against the gray sky. I was 36 at the time, traveling alone, and I had rented a small cabin outside of a forgotten town to take a break from work and city noise. I thought a few days in the quiet would be good for me, a way to clear my head. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt track that twisted through thin forest and sloped into a low valley. It looked older than I expected, the kind of place built by hand decades ago, patched up again and again. The boards on the porch were warped, the windows rattled with the wind, and the tin roof showed flecks of rust. The place was advertised as secluded, but standing there, unpacking my bags from the car, I realized secluded didn't quite cover it. I could see no neighbors, no cell towers, no streetlights, just dry grass, timber, and hills that folded into one another. Inside, The cabin smelled faintly of pine sap and stale smoke. The living area had a stone fireplace, a worn couch, and a few antlers mounted on the wall. The kitchen was small, with metal counters scratched up from years of use. The bedroom in the back was even smaller, with a single bed and a dresser that tilted slightly because of the uneven floor. I noticed a back door too, one that led out toward the slope behind the cabin. The lock on it was old and stiff, but it worked. The first day passed quietly. I walked some of the hillsides, cooked a simple meal, and sat outside on the porch as the sun went down. The air grew colder as the light drained away. The silence was thick, heavier than what I was used to. Even at night in the city, you hear something: sirens, engines, voices. Out there was only the sound of the wind moving the dry grass and the occasional crack of a branch. I tried to read under the dim yellow lamp in the living room, but I couldn't concentrate. Every creak of the cabin felt louder than it should have. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The bed was hard, the sheets smelled faintly of mildew, and my body stayed tense. Sometime after midnight, I thought I heard movement outside. It wasn't an animal rustling through brush. It was sharper, like the crunch of boots on gravel. I held still, staring at the ceiling, and the sound faded after a few seconds. I convinced myself it must have been a deer or maybe my imagination. Eventually, I drifted off. The second day, I tried to push it from my mind. I hiked further out, following an old trail that disappeared into a gulch. I saw no one. The whole time, I felt that sense of being watched. Not from above like in some movie, but the feeling that there could be someone just behind the trees, standing still. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed the back door didn't look the way I had left it. The old wood around the frame had fresh marks, like pressure had been put against it. I tested the lock. It held, but I knew I hadn't been imagining things. That night, the sounds came again. At first it was distant, somewhere near the slope, then closer, moving slow, stopping, then starting again. I lay there holding my breath, staring at the ceiling, every muscle locked. This time it wasn't brief. It went on for what felt like an hour. Crunching steps, then nothing. The silence after was worse, because I had no idea if whoever it was had left or was standing just outside. I didn't sleep much. By morning, I was exhausted. My hands shook while I made coffee on the old gas stove. I walked outside and studied the ground. The dirt was uneven, but I found faint impressions near the back of the cabin. Too wide for deer, too long for any small animal. They were shoe prints, the tread faint but still there. Someone had been walking around the cabin. I thought about packing up and leaving that morning, but I told myself I was being paranoid. The mind exaggerates things when you're alone, I reasoned. I tried to distract myself, chopping firewood, cleaning up the small living room, writing in a notebook. By late afternoon, the light began to sink again, and the fear crept back in. That night was the worst. The steps came again, closer, circling the cabin. I heard the porch boards groan as weight pressed down on them. My chest tightened so much I could barely breathe. Then there was a faint scrape, metal on wood, the sound of the back door handle shifting. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had no weapon, nothing but a dull kitchen knife. I sat on the floor in the dark, clutching it, every nerve in my body screaming. After a long while, the handle stilled. The boards eased. The steps moved away, slow, measured, until silence returned. I didn't close my eyes at all that night. I stayed awake until the gray of dawn filled the windows. When the sun rose, I stepped outside and checked the door. The lock was scratched, fresh marks gouged into the frame. Whoever had been there wasn't trying to scare me. They had been trying to get inside. I made my decision then. I stuffed my bag with clothes, shoved everything else back into the car, and left. As I drove down the dirt road, my rearview mirror showed the cabin shrinking into the distance. The hills and trees closed around it like it was being swallowed. My hands shook on the wheel, and I didn't stop until I hit the highway miles away. Later, when I thought about it in calmer moments, I realized how lucky I was. Out there, no neighbors would have heard me scream. No phone signal would have let me call for help. Someone had chosen that cabin, maybe because it was alone, maybe because travelers came and went. I don't know what their plan was if they had gotten in, and I don't want to know. The memory stuck with me. The smell of that old wood, the way the steps circled like a hunter, the sound of the handle turning. Even now, years later, when I hear a noise outside at night, my mind goes back to that cabin in Montana. I left with my life, but not with my peace. And I know with absolute certainty that someone out there had been waiting for the moment I let my guard down.